How's it going, friends? It's a big long video. I know it's longer than usual, so without any guff, grab yourself a brew and a bicky and let's jump straight into it. Let's have a quick look at the kit. As we can see from the exterior, it has some lovely rivet detail. There's very nicely detailed on the outside. The inside's not as quite as interesting as the outside. It's quite plain. There are obviously a few bits that we're going to have to put in, but generally it's quite a simple affair, unfortunately. But I mean, we will improve on that a little bit later. As you can see, put together, you know, it's quite a chunky, it's quite a chunky model. As for the instruments, again, very basic, but they are nice. Again, we have got some upgrades for this a little bit later on, but I mean, they are okay as they are. We've got the Bombay roof, if you like, here. A hell of a lot of ejector pins in there, but it's not something that's going to be very well seen anyway. But again, some nice detail. Front gun turret, again, quite, most of this is, you know, it's quite simple, but the detail's nice enough. For what we've got. I mean, a lot of these parts, I mean, in some respects do get a little bit buried within inside the aircraft anyway, so yeah, it's one of those things with this one. The radio set, again, very nice, simple, but you know, effective in what it needs to be. And again, a few more sets here and there. HK also gives you a nice sort of stand for it. It's this kind of come cradle, come sort of, I don't know, maintenance thing, which is quite nice. We won't be using within this build. We also have some nice big chunky clear parts as well. They're not the best, they're not, you know, the most crystal clear ones, but they will do. We also get this option of a full clear side, which I've done on a previous build. Varying ideas now that comes out, personally. It's kind of a bit obvious that actually it is a clear part. And obviously our decals, we have got one missing which I've used for a previous build, but we won't need it for this one. And a few bits of photo etch for the seat belts and the gun the Bombay sight as well. My friend Dave, at the time I got this kit, so I got this a couple of years ago now. Again, I'd done one for a customer. It's actually a friend of mine, so the payment actually was this kit, because I also wanted one for myself. Dave goes to this upgrade from Airscale. Really nice, very generally quite simple. Obviously, you can see there's the instruments, the dials there, and there's the actual threat with all the replacement bits that we're going to be wanting for this. So obviously the instrument panel and some of the dials within the aircraft. As we come to looking at the instructions, generally I think these are quite nicely laid out. They're quite, you know, like a blown out sort of diagram. There's about 20 steps for this, but the last few are mainly for the stands. Again, it's quite a straightforward build in my opinion. You do have sort of two options. You have the earlier version of the Lanc and a later one, which is actually only one scheme, which is, I think it's a Canadian one if I remember it rightly, which is V for Victorious, which is a Canadian Lanc. The other three are of the earlier variants, though we are doing S for Sugar, but I'm actually going to be doing this in the later variant, so we'll see how we work through that later on in the build. And as we look at the back, we have all the sort of colour call-out, or the brands that they're using for the colours, which is AK Tamil. So as all, well, I would say normally we'll start with the cockpit, but this is the cockpit, so we'll be starting with the seat. It's made up in several parts. They're quite chunky parts. They're not too much of a hassle to put together. The one thing I will suggest is when you put these sort of, like, I'm going to call them the retaining brackets for the seat to fit the floor, while they're still wet, put them into their actual locating holes. That will give you a good setting position for these. So especially if you're like me, where you paint everything sort of separately, this will help a lot later on when you come to put the seat in after you've painted it. Now, if I remember rightly, because it's been a couple of weeks since I've done this now, I think these are the only actual two injector pin marks. These are on the back headrest, or they're on a plated headrest. of the pilot seat. Fortunately they are raised, so they are a lot easier to remove, which I always prefer these sort of ones, because I'd just rather scrape them off than have to try and fill them out. Fortunately, because again we're not really seeing the bomb bay, they're all kind of recessed and in between all loads of little bits, so I'm glad I haven't got to, well, I'm just not going to deal with it, because it's just too much to have to worry about dealing with. Once we've done that, cleaned it all up, we can put that onto the seat. So what I've done with this build is the majority of this is basically made up in small subsections. Again, it's just the way I personally find is easier to paint a lot of these parts up, especially with somewhere like the radio sets and all those sort of things. They're just a little bit easier to sort of paint off the main model rather than having it all put together and painted up. I mean, not that you can't do that, it is a way of doing it, but I've just got this way of everything has to be put up into small parts, painted up, and then they can all go together later on in the build, which you will see as we go through this build, all these little bits coming together later on. And also because I'm going to add some wiring into the build, actually again, personal preferences, I actually find this a little bit easier with most of these parts out of the way, so we can sort of feed stuff through and hide them appropriately. So I've decided to make a parachute to go in the parachute sort of stowage position, and I went on the good old interwebs to find some good reference photos of RAF Bomber parachutes, and I managed to find a really good clear reference of one of these parachutes to make this one. Now I'm using green stuff from Green Stuff World for this. It's basically a sort of a two-part epoxy, really good for sort of like sculpting and moulding stuff like this, and because it's quite impressionable, a bit like myself, I've used a silicone brush to smooth out all my fingerprints that I've just left all over it. Now if you use quite a bit of water when sort of mixing and moulding it, helps not only keep it sort of supple, it also stops any of your tools and your fingers sticking to the stuff and making a right mess. Now I also need to make some sort of really thin sort of flappy parts to go on this. Now you can roll out green stuff to basically an inch of its life, and the best way of doing this is having a nice bit of card to work off, putting some baby powder down, rolling your bit of green stuff in it and get it coated all over, again because this helps it from not sticking to anything, and then just finding something that's nice, round and smooth to roll it out, and just quite literally roll it backwards and forwards. It's almost like a bit like baking a cake or a pizza really, so you just have to just keep rolling it backwards and forwards, keep putting a bit of baby powder over it again to stop it sticking to your tool. It does stick a little bit, but not to the point that you can't peel it off your tool. So yeah, baby powder, really good stuff. And then all I need to do with my hobby knife is just cut out a few of the flappy bits that I need for this parachute. There's sort of two triangular overlays and a small bit that goes in the middle. Again, if you put a bit of water on the knife, it should stop it from sticking to the knife. I've also made some little sausages, which again, like you know when you're playing with blue tack, just sort of roll it around and you'll get these nice little noodles. I've also made a bit of an imprint there as well to get these to sit in, because by the reference photo obviously it's tied up quite tight and these ropes are sort of sunken into the parachute. Now of course, obviously when you're putting these parts together, obviously they've had the baby powder on them, just put a bit of water down on either the part or on the part it's sticking to, or even both, doesn't really matter. That will obviously sort of just disintegrate the baby powder. It will slightly slip and slide around, as you can see it doing here, but once you've got in the right position, leave it to dry and it will stick there literally like glue. So yeah, it's pretty good. It's quite simple, takes a bit of practicing to get it right. I had a bit of backwards and forwards with this part, but in the end actually it kind of actually looked like the picture, so I was quite chuffed with myself with that. So the last thing I need to do was basically make a ripcord handle or a D-ring. So I've just used some copper wire for this, wrapped a little bit of green stuff around the bottom because by the photo it looks like it's in its own kind of like sort of like retaining pocket or something like that. But yeah, again it had baby powder on it, so just sort of wet it, and again it just, once it dried it stuck to it. So once I did that, I added a few of the smaller parts within the cockpit that I didn't need to sort of worry about painting separately, because most of these are going to be all painted in sort of pretty much cockpit interior green. Obviously the radio sets underneath, which will be underneath the navigator and radio operators table, are going to be painted black, but I'll pretty much only paint the sort of front and top of those, because you're not actually going to really see these once everything sort of goes together. Then goes in obviously a bit with our parachute on, which I'm going to paint that in position because it is actually quite easy to get to that part, and then a couple of the support poles for the table, and yeah, that's kind of what it looks like. I won't stick this into place. I'm going to paint this separately because I've got a few bits I want to do off that. Here we've got a set. I don't know what these parts are for, so I'm just going to call them sets because I just don't know what they are. As you can see, some of them have the brass backings that go on them rather than being obviously moulded as a solid block. But yeah, so these will go onto the post that's on the part with the parachute. And I'm also going to add some wires onto this as well. You can see sort of like some of the connector parts for where obviously wires are going to go into, and I'll be adding wires to all, well, pretty much most of those. So to make a relatively easy sort of connection for the wires into those connectors, on the obviously the back of them, I've used a hypodermic needle to make some small holes. This will just make it, you know, again, easy when we super glue the wires in as a decent anchor point for them. So at this point, I'd actually got a nice little present from a friend of mine and of the channel. So my friend Norman, who doesn't want to be mentioned by name, has very kindly sent me these figures for the Lancaster, and they are actually specifically designed for this particular Lanc nose section. As you can see up in the top corner there from Wing Cockpit Figures. Now, my understanding of these that the guy doesn't trade anymore, which is quite unfortunate because they are really, really nicely sculpted resin figures. Level of detail of these are absolutely bang on. The great detail of all the strapping, the belt buckles and the boots, everything really, really nicely done. Again, the faces, the helmet, the oxygen mask and tubing, just absolutely outstandingly done and cast. There's no real issues with these whatsoever. The only one I kind of had, which I'll show you in a bit, was as positioning them. But for this, they've made it a little bit easier. They actually give you the hands molded to the control column, which does actually make things a little bit easier in fitting this all together than trying to get your hands to fit over the existing part. Obviously that actually is the existing, but well, molded off the original control column. So as you see at the start, we have three figures for this Lanc, and obviously the first one obviously was the pilot. This one is the nose air gunner. I'll actually be repurposing him for the navigator, because for the standard Lancs, generally the Bombardier doubled up as the air gunner, and you tend to find it was really during the DAMS raids that they actually had the front gunner. The Bombardier, again, nice. All this detail at the bottom, particularly on the bottom, you don't see him lying down, but it's really nice that they're there. You have two different hands for the Bombardier. You have the standard one with the little trigger in his hand, and the other one is the sights if you want to do this as one of the Lancs that did the DAMS raid. Also, the Bombardier comes with a replacement, I don't know what it's actually called, I'm going to call it an armrest or sort of like resting pad. So obviously again, sort of all designed around for the Bombardier to lean on this perfectly, so you won't be using the original kit part for this. So what comes next with these crew members is a hell of a lot of dry fitting. As you can see, the pilot, he sits actually very nicely within the seat. So I've plonked him down. The control column is actually quite tight within between his knees, which actually is quite helpful trying to put his arms on. I did have a little bit of fun trying to get all this positioned right. But again, this is one of the benefits that you do with a lot of dry fitting. So I could get all this sort of sitting nice and snug and in the right position after he fell out of his seat about 10 times. So I did actually find it easy actually just to put his arms on first and then put the control column in. So what I've used for this is VMS's Flexi 5K super glue. This has a relatively slow-ish drying time, so I could put the super glue in, dry fit everything and reposition everything into the right places. The kind of only real issue I had here, now I think with part of the sculpting, they didn't really think about the feet going in the rudder pedal positions, so there was a little bit of fettling with this. Now because they are resin, what I actually did, which was a little bit stupid, was I used the lighter to sort of warm the legs up. Now I did sort of catch fire to one of his boots doing this, but if you just put it into some hot water, let it soak for a little minute, it will soften up the resin, and then I was able to pinch his legs together a little bit and get him seated on those pedals a lot better. And then afterwards I got him all into the right position. I was then able to glue in the armrests. And as you'll be able to see now is that everything all fits nice and snugly and all into the right place. It does sort of sit slightly to the left, but I think once everything is all done, painted, actually looks fine. Really, you don't really notice that sort of slight cockeyedness with it. But again, I will not be gluing him into place, and obviously the instrument panel, because we've still got work to do there, and obviously I want to paint them completely separate. So I then moved on to doing the nose turret. Now originally I was going to have the air gunner in the turret before Norm reminded me that actually I didn't need to actually have him in, and suggested repurposing him for the navigator's position. Now the makeup of the turret is generally simple and straightforward, but there are a lot of components to put in here. So again, the same as the seat, I'd suggest try and fit in everything kind of at the same time when the glue is still a little bit wet, and it will make it easier for everything to sort of be aligned properly for when it sits into its ring mount. Once you've got this all together, there is a bit of a frame that goes around the top and connects to the mounts. These are a little bit, in the instructions they're not very clear in exactly where these parts are supposed to go, so what I did find, I had the same problem the first time I did this one, so just put it together and you'll kind of see where actually everything is exactly where it is supposed to go. So let's move on to some detailing. Now, as you remember earlier, I said I'm going to add in some wiring into the aircraft, and starting with this set we was looking at earlier, as you remember I made some small holes using a hypodermic needle, which gives, again, like I said earlier, a good anchoring point when you super glue these into place. Now this wire is electrical wire. I've stripped it out of an old, obviously, bit of cable and braided it up a little bit to make it look like a proper wiring loom, and it's really good for this sort of stuff. The only thing I find with it is it's kind of a little bit inflexible in some ways. It tends to sort of remember its previous position, so trying to run it around things sometimes it can be a little bit difficult, and trying to sort of maneuver it into position. But for stuff like long wiring looms and those kind of things, actually is really good for. Another little thing that you can do to these wiring looms, which I haven't actually done with this because most of it isn't going to be seen very well, but every so often if you put a little bit of masking tape, a little band of masking tape around it, actually looks like the sort of anchoring or mounting points to whatever you're going to mount it to. So obviously, like with the aircraft, you can make it look like it's actually mounted within the aircraft. Now also I have decided to make things extremely more difficult for myself within this build. Well, it's not really difficult, it just become a massive problem later on down the road, which we'll get to. I've decided to add lighting into the aircraft. So the blue and red wire, as you can see, obviously is one of the LEDs. This goes into what would be a small lamp that sits next to the Bombardier in this particular position. So obviously I made a small hole for the wire to feed through. It actually sits just underneath the actual lamp, though. I'm actually going to have these lights kind of a bit unrealistically bright, just so you can sort of see it and see these things within the aircraft. Obviously this is not going to be overly accurate, it's a little bit of artistic license with this bit, just to make the model a little bit more interesting. Now, as you can see, I've used that same wiring again to make a nice long wire loom. As you can see, I'm super gluing it as I go, because again it wants to sort of retain to its relatively kind of like straightness, so it is a little bit of you know, fettling to get this to sort of like look good and sit right. For most of the other wiring, particularly a lot of the single lengths, I've actually used lead wire. Now lead wire is a lot more flexible to use, so what I tend to do with this is I'll super glue it into position, kind of let it dry, let it go off a little bit, so it's got a sort of has a solid sort of anchor point, and then I can snake it around the aircraft or around the areas that I want it to go around with a lot more ease than I would with the steel wire. And as you can see here, as I said, I've populated a few wires, super glued them into place. Once that's all sort of dried and got a nice solid anchor point, I can then start manoeuvring these wires around. And again, with lead wire, it's, you know, it's really soft, so it will conform to literally anything that you want it to conform to. And you know, it's really good stuff. They come in a variety of different sizes, obviously, as well. So you know, it's always good to have a nice little mix of these sort of things and get, you know, give different sort of variations of different types of pipes and wires. So I've also used copper wiring for some of these, for some of the pipes that go up up in sort of the roof area, which again you're not really going to see these at all. So I've drilled a couple of holes in and bent them round. I did actually anneal them earlier on just to make them a little bit more flexible, but again they do tend to want to sort of resist the shape that you're trying to put them into. But what I've done here is I've dry fitted the cockpit flooring just to make sure that they're all sort of sitting up into the right positions. Later on I'll glue them in better, but also I can see where other wires need to go or where need to go, because of course, you know, you don't want to be putting wires into areas that, you know, like particularly like the cockpit floor sits, and then, you know, you can have a few issues. So I've done this pretty much throughout the cockpit. So all the panels pretty much that need wires going to them have had wires put into them. Again, drilled them out, glued them into place, give them a good anchor point. As you can see here again, how good it is to use the lead wire, because it's very supple and very easily to move around any parts you need it to. Now, admittedly, a lot of this isn't 100% accurate, particularly up in the Bombardier section, because mainly it'll take forever to get everything like dead accurate. But I have used two sources to get as much of it as, you know, kind of right or as accurate as I possibly could. One of which is actually an aircraft tour around Just Jane, and there's another one which is a 360 of the cockpit of S for Sugar, which helped quite a lot because I found a few parts that I didn't know existed on the aircraft, so they were quite helpful. I will link both of these websites down in the description below. So I thought I don't know why I thought it was a clever idea, but I thought it a clever idea to try and make the navigator's lamp. I've got so many problems with me. So it generally actually wasn't all that difficult really to make. So the bottom part of the lamp, which is fixed into the desk, was made from some old bits of sprue. Everything else was some styrene rod. It did take a little bit of time just because you had to let the glue sort of set solid before you started adding more parts to it, but it generally went quite well. The springs were made again with lead wire, so all I did with those is that I wrapped them around a bit of copper wire, and then just wrapped them around really tightly to make the springs, and then super glued those into place. The lamp heads sort of somehow fell into place really. So that was again another bit of styrene tube. It was it was more of a tube than a rod, and I was trying to widen it because it wasn't very wide. So I just put a bit of heat underneath it just to try and push something in there to sort of spread it, and it just sort of melted into the right position, so I was quite happy with that. So the next thing to do was to fit an LED into it. Now these are quite easy to get hold of. I've got these off, actually got these off Wish, but you can get them off eBay as well and other places. But if you look up micro LEDs 0402, that will be this exact LED. It's basically I think it's roughly around about a 0.5mm LED. Now these ones are actually white, but what I've done is I've dipped them in some Tamiya clear yellow and dotted on a little bit of orange while it was still wet to give, you know, these sort of old school sort of, I was going to say they're not halogen, are they, but the old school sort of. Then all I had to do was make a small hole in the top and run the wires through. Now I also have put a bit of chrome pen marker within the lamp just to hopefully try and spread some of the light out and spill out into the model. I should have actually braided the wire before actually feeding it through, because afterwards when I braided it, it actually snapped, so that wasn't ideal. So most of obviously glued the headlamp back on after braiding the wire, and then just run it down the back of the lamp later. And as always, it's very good to continuously test these things to make sure everything still works. Now, to sort of speed things along a little bit in this video, because as the time of editing this video, I've got about 2 hours worth of footage left to try and edit. So I've already pre-painted everything, just again, like I said, speed things on. Obviously the front half is pretty much black, and the rest of the cockpit is in like a cockpit green colour. Now obviously we painted it black. Most of all that wiring that I've done earlier on is pretty much almost invisible. I am going to try and pick it out a little bit later on, but inevitably when it all goes together you can't really see it at all in there. Before I could move on to everything else, just quickly needed to paint up some of the other sets and some of the wiring up. So in an attempt to make things a little bit more easy to be seen in the Bombardier section, I gave everything a dry brush. So I basically used a kind of, it was more of a grey or a whitey grey, pale grey, that will do. Just dry brushed it all over the instruments, the framework and the wiring. Again, at the point of here, you being able to see it in the video, you know, it does pop out and it actually makes, you know, quite a nice difference. I mean, I use this technique quite a bit, particularly on instrument panels on aircraft that I either haven't got decals for or just can't be bothered to paint properly. But it gives you a nice sort of like little pop. Also can give you sort of like the impression of, you know, sort of scratches and a bit of wear and tear, which again for the instrument panels and stuff like that you can see I've done here. As we move back to the navigator's position, I thought it'd be nice to actually give him a map to work from. So I've got some of these maps which I've just printed off the internet basically. A lot of the time with a lot of the maps that I get, I just find them off, you know, pictures of the maps off the internet, put them into Word, make about a dozen or so different sizes in different scales, because I haven't got a clue, so it's just sort of like guesswork, and just print a load of them out and then cut out the ones that I feel that are about the right size. Once I've done that, you can probably just about see there's a small hole at the back of where the map is, and obviously that's for where our little lamp's going to go. In fact, I actually made 2 holes there. I made one obviously for the lamp itself to sit into, and another one to hide the wire down the back. Now once this is all together, again the wiring we have an issue with. We'll get to that a little bit later on, but as it is, once it all goes together you wouldn't really see the wire anyway. I do also paint it black as a just in case, but I've run it sort of down the back of the basically, or the back of that part there, and run it out of where basically the wing spar is. And then again another quick test just to make sure everything's working, and also basically just show you guys how this is going to look like when it all goes together. So next I'm doing all the instruments. So basically the same as any other photo etch sort of upgrades, we need to remove all the original detailing so that we're unable to put the new replacement parts on. Now of course with these we need to put the decals down first, and then we can put the overlay of the actual instruments over the top. Now, particularly the instrument panel is going to be something that is going to be seen a lot more clearly than the other instruments, but I've done it through all of them anyway. And basically I've put some UV resin in all the bevels to give the impression of a glass bevel. Again, like I said, the instrument, the control columns in particular is going to be seen very well, so I think this gives it a nice little added boost. I did have to put about two or three layers on the top just to bring some of them up, but I think that, you know, really adds a lot more to it than not putting it in at all. So I've also added another light into the cockpit. This one goes over one of the other instrument panels. As you can see, I've run it down how I've run it down the back, and again into the same area because I need all the lighting to basically go in the same way. I've managed to cut the lamp off the original moulding. As you can see, the LED there sticking through it. I know it's not brilliant, but once it's all done and dusted, it looks okay. This one's a red one, so most of the lighting in the aircraft would have been red for the most part, so the crew can still see and do things without destroying their night vision. So at this point I start putting everything into the cockpit. All the instrument panels and whatnots can start going in. Now I will mention before the whole thing gets buttoned up is that, and I had this problem before because I've done exactly the same with the other one, is that I think that the instrument panel, or the photo etch part of the instrument panel, is slightly too big, because when I put the two sides together, they don't actually go together very well. In fact, right at the end they didn't go together very well, but I managed to get it to work. But I did have to take a little bit of a chunk out of either side of the fuselage where the instrument panel set, as you can see here. It helped a little bit. You see there's a little bit of a channel there, but I still had a little bit of a gap. So let's have a look at the crew. I've painted them off camera because I'm not usually very impressed with my painting skills, but I'm actually kind of regretting actually not filming this part for you because they actually turned out quite decent in the end. Now, for the majority of these figures, I blocked in most of the colours, so like, you know, the sort of like the brown for the jacket, blue for the trousers, the sort of sandy colour for the Mae West and all that sort of business. And then afterwards I sort of dry brushed everything else. Now, as you can see here with the navigator, who was the front gunner, I've managed to manipulate his legs around a little bit. You can see there was a couple of cuts in there, so I basically gave him a bit of a hatchet job on his knees to get him to sit underneath the navigator's table. Fortunately, because the way he's facing, his legs underneath the table, you don't really see it. And then you can see the bombardier as well, looking pretty decent. The goggles also added a bit of that UV resin there because, you know, they're supposed to be glass. And then we have our fourth member. Now, embarrassing, this is terrible. Fortunately, we don't actually see this figure. I just needed a body in the radio operator's position. So I've botched this from a 35th scale, copper 35th scale figures. I've added his oxygen mask and tubing because, again, I'm hoping that in the position through the side windows and the Astrodome at the top, you can just see a figure. So I didn't worry too much about any form of actual detailing, because realistically the pilot is obviously going to be the main figure that you're going to see. You can see the bombardier pretty well, and also the navigator at the right angle. So I didn't worry too much about that last figure, but I know it's not the best, but I says it's just a silhouette for that back. Now, even though I did mould the navigator into the right position, it was a little bit of a fiddle to get him to sit right, because he is quite snug underneath. But I'm sure you agree, I think I did actually quite a good job of getting him in there. As you can see, I've added a little pencil into his hand again. You're not really going to see that. This is more sort of partly my benefit and the fact that, you know, we can see it on video here and the photos. Yeah, that's the only evidence we're going to really have of half of this. But I'm really chuffed of actually how this has fitted in. And again, massive thanks to Norm for sending us these figures. It's been an absolute great addition. A bombardier again fits in really nicely. As you can see, I've added a little wire coming from the bomb release trigger. Even though the pilot obviously had all his buckles and whatnot's already moulded onto the figure, there was no buckles that went from obviously himself or the rest of his buckles onto the seat. So that was very easily done. I've just used some Tamiya masking tape, measured it at about the right thickness of the straps that are on the figure, and I had this spare bit of photo etch which looks about the right sort of type of fitting for the seat belts. So I just super glued those onto the photo etch, and then super glued them onto the seat and then onto the figure, and then painted them accordingly to match in with everything else. And as you can see, I've tried to align it as much as possible with what I think is the right belt it should match up with. Also, you may or may not have noticed up on the cockpit instrument panel there is a little bit of masking tape. On the end of that masking tape is yet another light. Now again, I know this is probably not, well, it definitely isn't accurate, but again, I just wanted to show the pilot off, and again add a little bit more interest and sort of dynamic to the model. With the main cockpit full glued in and all the pipes in the right places, I was able to put the handrail in. And before anybody tries to tell me it's yellow, as far as I'm aware with this one, it actually is black. I mean, okay, it probably should be yellow, but I'm going off the website, which is of, as I said, S for sugar as it is now. I know the aircraft over the years has had a lot of restoration, and I know some of it as it is now isn't quite right, but I'm going out as it is because there's a potential that it probably is right, but I'm not going to argue about it. But as we can see now, all the crew, all in place, all pretty much ready to go for the other half to be fitted in. But before that, I need to add another light in. I watched an entire half-an-hour video to figure out whether there was actually a light within the front turret position. And quite literally at the end of the video was when I found out it does actually have a light. I was also quite surprised to find that the dorsal turret also has a light. They are very similar to the navigator's lamp. I'm not quite sure why. I assume for the same reasons, you know, with the red lights before, you know, it's using a red light at night, you can still see what's going on and it doesn't blind you. So if you need to turn the light off, you've still got a bit of that night vision left. So yeah, I fitted it in anyway because I thought, again, feels like it sort of adds. When I dry fitted this at one point and trying out all the lights, it just looked weird it actually not having a light in it. So I'm glad to find out that it does have the light fitting in. It was a bit of a pain in the backside to try and feed it through, because it needs to feed through a back panel, which technically should not be there. Also, the engineer seat is also wrong, but I wasn't going to attempt to try and rebuild one of those from scratch. But anyway, the light, it's in, it's all fitted in. I had to fit it within the turret and fit the glass in and everything and put it all together rather than putting it in later on. In fact, actually, I think it probably is slightly easier putting it in at this point. So now we can move on to the canopy. Now HK's kit comes with a blister that is completely separate to the glazing, which actually goes on to a solid piece. Now obviously it's not right, because it's, as you can see, this is, from this one it should be like this, is actually blown into the perspex. So this one actually is from the border models one, and Norman had sent me this with a few of the goodies, which one of which we'll get onto in a little bit, which really sets this whole thing off. Sent me these up to replace. Now unfortunately they're short. It doesn't actually fit within the panel itself. If I'd have cut it where it fits, there'd be an extra panel that shouldn't be there, and they're also too tall. I did have a go at removing that sort of panel piece, unfortunately to no good avail really. Unfortunately, as much as I tried sanding it and, you know, all through the sponges to the polishing, and then even with some compound, it just looked terrible. So unfortunately I couldn't use it, and I'm a little bit gutted I couldn't, you know, because again, at the kindness of their art, they sent us this to make the model better, and unfortunately I couldn't use it. So with the kit blisters glued in, I can then move on to masking the canopy. Now I've done this all by myself rather than buying a vinyl masking set, which I mean I'm using vinyl mask anyway, so all I'm doing is putting basically a chunk to cover a couple of the windows up. I'll burnish the edges down with a cocktail stick so they get them all nice into the corners, and then with a sharp hobby blade very carefully run the blade against the side of the frame, and that will be able to cut out all the frames, give nice sharp edges, and saves you a little bit of money, to be fair. One of the other ways I do canopies, which I usually do for my 48th kits, is basically using Tamiya masking tape. I usually tend to find cutting thin strips are really good, because then you can just cut them to all sorts of lengths and use the straightest part, preferably the bit you've just cut, to run up against the side of the flat edges of the window frames. It's also really good for curved edges, which I will show you in a second. So what I tend to do for the square windows is I will try and cut a longer length, preferably. Run it again, like I said before, down the side of the straightest edge of the panel, and then get it to the position that I want it in, and then just cut off the extra length off. And then obviously repeat that all the way around the frame. But like I said, it's exactly the same for any curved edges, like around the Astrodome here. So cut a fairly thin strip, because the sort of thinner the better, but not too thin, because what I tend to do is I'll build off the edge of that bit of tape to fill in the rest of the window. But a nice thin piece means that you can quite easily manipulate it around any curved edges. And this is basically what I mean by building off from the mask. Now obviously with these blisters and stuff like the Astrodome around the back, using liquid mask, we've got a nice bit of relatively thick, not too thick, but thick tape to be able to basically join it up and fill it all in. Now this is where we make it look a little bit more interesting and look right. So like I said at the start of the video, I don't want to use the stands that it comes with, because I wanted to basically make this like the Border models one, which got a nice little stand and sort of look like it's flying. Unfortunately the kit obviously doesn't come with the Bombay doors, which you can see because they're pretty big. The box itself is actually quite small, but the Bombays are quite big, so obviously they're not going to put them in, which obviously means that I needed to get some and cut them down to size. Again, thanks to Norman, because we was having this conversation what I wanted to do with this kit, offered up some spares for me to be able to do it. So basically what I'd done is I'd fitted them up against the Bombay and masked them off at the end of the aircraft. So now for the one side, this worked perfectly well. For the other side, for some reason when I offered it up to the model, it seemed a bit short. That's because this plonker decided to cut it on the wrong side of the tape. So fortunately, because I'm using a razor saw, the cut wasn't too wide, though it obviously was very messy, as you can see. I managed to glue it on and using some sprue glue to fill in all the gaps. Now I've got to admit, I was a little bit worried about this, because usually my filling in and sanding is usually pretty awful, and you can usually still see the seam afterwards. Fortunately, I actually did a very good job at filling it in, sanded it, and it was all good. Although I did have to put some of the riveting detail back in, that wasn't really too much of a problem, because I actually have some riveting tools for that. Also, you can see on the back there is a nice big thick bit of plastic to blank off the back. I've also filled in where the wing spar should be, and again what I've done with that is just again filled it with a bit of plasticard, put some sprue glue over it, and then reintroduced the rivet. Even though I know technically that's where there should be some elements of a wing spar, but I thought I don't know, there was something about it I thought make it just look like it carries on, and just, you know, there's more to it but you can't see it. As you can see, the bomb doors are fitted. I put a bit of plastic rod in there to help fit it in, because originally I was actually going to have the doors closed, so I cut off the tabs for it to fit, but because Norman had sent me the figures, I then decided to have it open, and as you can see I'd used some brass rod there to use as the hydraulics for the door. So now we can finally move on to doing some painting. Now as you can see, obviously I haven't put the canopy on because I wanted to paint that rear part of the cockpit the same green as the rest of the camo that will be going. So I've done a bit of pre-shading with this one. and I've started off with a yellow, because obviously with a green over a yellow, sorry, that will pop out a little bit more. For the brown, I used a dark red. I'm not quite sure why I did that. In the end, I actually had to completely redo it and post shade it as I went on. I really could do with actually sort of learning colour theory a bit better. Also doesn't help the fact that I had to use a brown primer because it's all I got in stock. So originally, to start off with the brown, I actually used Tamiya's Flat Earth and Red Brown. Later on, when I redo this, I end up using Flat Earth and Buff, because I felt that the brown was way too dark. Again, most of this, I think this was because I was doing this over a brown primer, and it just wasn't looking right to me at all. So that's the colour I went with. The green, I used Tamiya's REF2, which is XF81. For the green, I used Tamiya's REF Green 2, which is XF81. So all I did with this was gave it a nice like passing over the top, building up the layers, so we can still see that sort of yellow, or basically it'll be giving sort of like a kind of lock and modulation, a bit of a kind of sort of worn kind of look. As you can see, I free-handed all the camo lines very carefully and keeping the airbrushes close to the model. I've been using, if you've been watching me for a while, you know I've been using gallery airbrushes for a while now, and they are really good. They give some really nice tight lines. As you can see, the feather in there is between the two camos is really nice. Now, if you are interested in or having a bit more of a look at these airbrushes, I've got a couple of videos on the airbrush itself. But if you are interested, there is a affiliate link in the description down below, as well as a discount code, which will obviously give you a little bit of money off. It's about 10%. Now, like I said, I have been using them for a while, and I generally can really recommend them. I think they're absolutely fantastic airbrushes to use. And also, I'm not somebody just to sort of, you know, BS anybody to buying anything, because I'll only, you know, recommend stuff to people if I genuinely think it's good. If I thought it was rubbish, I would have told you and wouldn't even mention this part at all in the video. Now, at this point, you can see I've added one of the pitot tubes and the antenna at the front. I've only added these at this point because I didn't want to risk knocking them at any point and breaking them off. Now, if you are doing the earlier version of this, you don't use these. This is only for the later version. So the hole that I'm about to glue the pitot tube into, the surround of that you will need to technically completely remove and fill in. One of the things that I say annoyed me, this will actually work quite well if you're doing it on its original stand. The way it's been moulded has actually got a cover, or pitot tube cover, over them. So I tried to remove it and did quite a bad job. So later on, what I will do is, again, using some hypodermic needles, cut down, drill a small pilot hole for them to fit into, and again, good anchor point for them to be able to be glued in. So now at this point, I can then mask off the lower half of the fuselage and paint the black. Now, it's always good to paint your camo or any top colours down as far as possible, because this will give you a lot less hassle later on. You won't have to go masking everything off, trying to bring all those camos back down to sort of any tide lines or change of colour. I completely masked the top half of the aircraft off, particularly obviously around the turret area, because that is also going to be completely black. Also, I don't trust myself very much at masking, so normally I do tend to try and just will spray it as it is, but that usually goes wrong, and then usually involves me having to remask and repaint everything all over again. So the entire top half has been completely encased in masking tape, so there should be no bleeds whatsoever. Right then, black. Now, we don't really want to use pure black, because realistically it just does not look right on models. As weird as it sounds, paint changes colour in scale. So you do get a lot of people that will whinge about certain colours not being right because they've matched up against, you know, a real life reference, and it just doesn't work like that, unfortunately. So paint actually weirdly is scaled down, as weird as that sounds. So what I've done for this is I've used German black for this, rubber black for this. Normally I'd use German black, but I had to use rubber black because I didn't have any German black, which is effectively just like a dark grey. You can also use NATO black, which I usually use Tammy, and I've had a few bottles and they've slightly changed colour the last few times. Some of them being a bit of a very dark grey, and some of them a bit like too light. So what I've done, I've used rubber black for this and added a bit of black. I should added a little bit of blue. Now I should have actually added a little bit more blue into that, but I was actually quite happy with how this turned out. Now as well, you can see I've done a pre-shading underneath, again trying to sort of lift the model, make it look a bit used, a bit old, and just basically not new. Now I've painted the Bombay semi-gloss black because I believe this is right. Now if I am wrong, I'm quite happy to be stand corrected on this, but as far as my understanding, that the wells and the bays are of a sort of a gloss black. Obviously if the doors need to open during the night, you don't want a bright colour shining through, but the gloss there is, so again it's still black, but crewmen and that can still see a bit easier. I'm not sure. I think I may have made that up, but yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that is right. Now before I put the canopy on, I needed to put this bit of armour plate glass in. Now I actually didn't realise this was actually a thing until I was looking at S for Sugar, the cockpit tall thing I was talking about earlier. I was quite surprised actually. I didn't actually know this was a thing. Now I've been told that actually this is quite common. I have never seen anything with them in whatsoever. The ones that are about at the moment, the BBMFs and some of the ones that are in museums, I've not seen one of them with this plated glass in. Now I do believe it's something that was put in a little bit later on, but I thought it was actually really cool and quite interesting, something, a bit of a different find. Now I had this exact same issue on the previous one I built. It's the fact that the canopy just does not sit right for some reason. Now at this point I had actually already moved a large amount of plastic that sort of technically sits around where the instrument panel is, and it's seated a little bit better, but there's still a few gaps, mainly across that side there and on the other side. So for this I've just used some putty, just basically smeared it into the gap, forced it in as much as I could so it would get into the cracks, and then with a slightly moistened cotton bud just run it along those gaps, and hopefully it will remove any putty that has gone further than the gap that I'm trying to fill. It doesn't usually work out for some reason. Sometimes does, sometimes doesn't, but basically if it does, give it a bit of chance to dry and then just keep applying up to the point where it fills all your gaps. At this point, this is where everything really starts to go wrong. I now have 6 lights in this model. Now 2 sets of 3 will go into 2 wires, okay? The others have to go in completely separately because they all need to be wired up to resistors, their own resistors, which then I can then lead into 2 wires. Now the LED wires are quite slim and they're not overly strong. Even though they are soldered up, they have a tendency to snap. Now I lost one at one point, which was one of the red ones in the cockpit. I then decided to rip the back off and feed a wire all the way down to that section, which is pretty much all the way up to the front, and glue it into place. Sweet, that was good. And then it went really wrong because then the pilot's light and the navigator's light for some reason stopped working. Now the reason I've done it this way, I should have realistically run all the wires down the pipe that I was mounting the model to. I'm gluing it together with epoxy resin so it all sits nice. I for some reason thought that the epoxy would get too hot and ruin the wires. Don't know why I thought that, I just did. So I then had to feed all these wires through a extremely small gap Now the pipe sits central at the back of the model. Only half of that hole is accessible because of the way the back is moulded. By this point I've cut the wires down so much that I have got basically nothing to work with. So I thought the only way I'm going to do this is remove the canopy. It's the only way I can fix those two lights. It's traumatic is the word for this. It was all going really well. It was coming off quite nicely, even though I'd actually glued most of this down with Tamiya extra thin. But as I said, just there was a few gaps, so they weren't really stuck down. I was prizing it off, going really well. Then the whole thing folded in my hand. I'm now without a canopy. Fortunately, Norman comes to the rescue yet again with this project, and I have obviously since repaired the lights. They were quite easy to get to because they were basically at the whole of the cockpit area, and I was able to feed the wires down the back and back down into the pipe into the lower half of the base. I literally could have cried. So with that debacle over and fixed, I can then finally move on to wiring the rest of this model up. Now, like I said, I've got 2 blue wires running down and 6 red ones. One set is for the red lights and the other set is for the white. Now what I need to do is all the red ones need to be soldered up onto resistors, and then I can put them into one singular wire and then run them to a battery pack, which is one of these 3-volt watch batteries. There'll be 2 because obviously I'm wiring up completely separately. Then each will be wired to their own switches. To be fair, at this point it is pretty much straightforward and everything actually goes really well. It is a simple wiring system. It's the same sort of thing that you learnt when you was at school, so the only difference really is that we've added resistors in. So what we have is the blue wire will run to the negative on the battery pack, then you'll have a red wire that will run to the switch, and then from the switch there'll be another red wire which is basically running to the lights. All the resistors and all the wires, as much as I could, all had heat shrink wrap put around them just in case anything touched something else that shouldn't and shorts out the circuit, because everything in the bottom of this base is quite tightly compact. So while I was waiting for the new canopy to arrive, I thought I might as well carry on with the decals. Now, because I'm doing S for Sugar a lot later in its career, the decals that you get with it, and it's the same with, for some reason, every S for Sugar kit, they do it from when it was of its 100th. Now, because I wanted to do it basically towards the end of its career, I needed a few extra missions. Now, the ones that are on the decal sheet aren't remotely the same as the ones that are on this one. So fortunately, my mate Dave comes to the rescue for me on this one and sent me his set of S for Sugar decals, which then meant I could add the last 16 sorties that S for Sugar was on. I also just want to mention, just in case anybody tries and starts anything over this, I have copied this from original photos of S for Sugar towards the end of her service. Now, okay, they're black and white, but as far as I'm aware, this is as accurate as she was before ending her service. Now, unfortunately, the clear parts debacle hasn't yet quite ended. So, Norm very kindly also sent some masks. I'm not sure whose they were or anything like that, but they weren't the best, unfortunately. Not only, well, that bleed was my own fault, and also the muck that's inside, so they had to be, well, the fishbowl had to be removed, and I had to clear all that out. For some reason, with the canopy mask that he'd sent me, they left quite a bit of residue on them for some reason. Don't know why this happened. I've never had it. These were vinyl masks, which I've never ever had a problem with. So I had to go about trying to clean it the best I could. Now, I'd run out of isopropanol, which I'd normally use to clean the clear parts. I had to actually use Mr. Leveling Thinner, which amazingly and surprisingly to me didn't melt the plastic. I then used a cocktail stick to remove any excess paint after that. I then did my best after that by using several goes over with some Tamiya polishing compound. I did the best I could. Unfortunately, it's not great, but I did what I could. So there we go, my friends. It's nearly time to show you this finished build, and my god, it's been a build. I've got to admit, with all the problems that I've had, really have enjoyed this one. I'm really chuffed on actually how this one turns out. So very quickly, before I let you see it, I want to say a massive thank you for you guys for watching the video. As always, I do genuinely hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a little bit out of this one. Basically, don't fold your canopy. Oh, it's just too traumatic. But anyway, I also say a massive thank you to channel members Darren Hall and John Alec from John Alec Scale Modelling. It's very, very much appreciated for your support through memberships. If any of you guys would also like to help further, there are links in the description down below for being a channel member. But liking, subscribing, watching the videos and popping some comments down the bottom massively helps the channel grow. Also, on that note, if you do have any comments, please put them down the bottom. I'd like to know your thoughts on this build. Anyway, on that note, thanks ever so much again for watching. Generally hope you have enjoyed this build. I hope you enjoyed the finished model. So until next time.
Right, now I want the last minute correction. Yeah. I'll fly steady now.
Stand at night, straight and level.
Bomb doors open.
Bomb doors open.
Give her a little bit of extra time if anything.
In. Left, left. 20, steady. Steady. 25. Bombs away. 30. There goes the cookie.
Lucky, lucky, lucky.
Oh, we got lucky going over there. And there go the Angeles. There goes my bottle.
Take Jettison action.
Jettison action now.
Okay, I think they're firing it up.